Hi, this is Marshall Toplansky.
And Joel Kotkin.
And welcome to the Feudal Future podcast. If you're listening, it means you're interested in creating a better future, one that values diverse discussion and preserves opportunity for the middle and working classes.
This is why we started the show, to bring together ideas and people that challenge the notion of a hierarchical, socially stagnant, and centrally programmed future. Maybe you've experienced the rising costs of home ownership, diminishing job prospects, or the burden of over-regulation and increasingly censorship. This is happening in cities everywhere, and we recognize the need for new action.
For this reason, we created the Beyond Feudalism Facebook group, a place for you to connect and share resources with like-minded people. Here you'll be able to ask questions, network, and share your own stories and ideas on how we can bring opportunity and common sense back into our civil discourse and governance.
Consider this a hub for all things feudal, where we'll be sharing insights from our recent Beyond Feudalism report with Chapman University, clips and highlights from the podcast, and links to related content on topics such as housing, education, energy, transportation, and entrepreneurship. Much of our focus has been so far on California, but we expect to see this work and apply this work to conditions around the world.
Well, as you can probably tell, we're not too excited about the path we're currently on as a society, but we are hopeful for what's possible. And if we can better understand what's happening and build momentum to overcome the trends, so much the better.
So we encourage you to join the Facebook group via the link below to get involved and keep up-to-date information on all new developments. And for more information, my new book, The Coming of Neo-Feudalism, outlines everything that's happening and where we need to change. The link to that is also in the show description.
So thank you very much for tuning in, and we hope you enjoy the show.
There is a very concerted effort at the moment by the politically correct academic community in urban planning, and I'm not calling out all urban planners and I'm not calling out all academicians. There is a very serious attempt to try to basically say density is not a problem. Now you tell me how a disease that passes person to person can't be a problem when things are overcrowded. We're talking about sunrises in the West studies. I mean, it's a real problem. I think we do need to sit down, forget political correctness, forget ideology, and figure out what happened.
This is Joel Kotkin.
And this is Marshall Toplansky.
And you're listening to the Feudal Future podcast. Our society is being rapidly reduced to a feudal state, a process now being exacerbated by the COVID-19 pandemic. Millions of small businesses are near extinction. Millions more are losing their jobs, and many others will be stuck in the status of propertyless serfs. The big winners have been the expert class of the clerisy, and most of all, the tech oligarchs, who benefit as people rely more on algorithms than human relationships.
With this, around the world, the middle class is becoming more squeezed than ever. And it's having profound economic, social, and spiritual implications. Here on the show, we're having conversations with business, government, and citizen leaders like you to get to the core of these issues and explore how we can work together to form a better future than the one we're headed towards. Welcome to another episode of the Feudal Future podcast. Hi, I'm Marshall Toplansky.
I'm Joel Kotkin.
And Joel, you are joining us from an undisclosed location where you are quarantining in place.
Right.
We both actually ventured out this past couple of weeks to, in my case, to Nashville, in your case, to Tucson. And so we're hoping that we've not picked up anything along the way, but we are totally pleased to report that we did pick up our long-term colleague, Wendell Cox. Wendell, thank you for joining us.
Pleasure to be with you.
And for those of you who don't know Wendell, who is a long longtime collaborator with Joel and I. Wendell is principal in a company called Demographia, which is based in the St. Louis area. He's a senior fellow at the Urban Reform Institute in Houston and a senior fellow for municipal policy and housing affordability at the Frontier Center for Public Policy in Winnipeg, and a member of the Board of Advisors at the Center for Demographics and Policy at Chapman University, which Joel and I are closely associated with. He has served as a visiting professor at the Conservatoire National des Arts et Métiers in Paris, and he was appointed to 3 terms on the Los Angeles County Transportation Commission by Mayor Tom Bradley, and to the Amtrak Reform Council by Speaker of the House Newt Gingrich. He's a graduate of Cal State Los Angeles and has earned his MBA degree from Pepperdine. So, Wendell, welcome.
Thank you. Pleasure to be with you.
You know, you've lately have done a lot of interesting work that looks at the correlation between density in an area and COVID infection and deaths. Would you like to tell us a little bit more about that?
Be happy to. My work has really been focusing on deaths. You know, what we've seen is a very strong relationship between higher density and higher rates of death from COVID. Now, we look at density a little bit different than others do. Right now, the best density information you can get in the United States is at the county level. There is some information below the county level, but for the most part, national data is only available at the county level. One of the problems, however, is that county density is a terrible measure for density because, for example, I'll give you an example, San Bernardino County is about as large as Costa Rica and has a population density of 100. Where, for example, Cuyahoga County in Ohio, where Cleveland is, has a population density of about 3,000 per square mile in terms of its, but it's all urban. And so the problem was that there are just too many big counties in the country that are very low density, but yet have huge urbanization, as, for example, in San Bernardino County. This chart shows you what we put out a couple of weeks ago, 3 weeks ago, as our conclusions based upon the data through July 8. And these are deaths per 1,000 population based upon the urban population density, not the county population density. So, for example, in dealing with San Bernardino County, we're only looking at essentially Ontario to Beaumont, and of course the Victorville and the Apple Valley area and so on. And what we find is a huge relationship between higher death rates and higher urban densities. You can see over at the far end, 50,000 and over, Manhattan being fairly high. The second level, 25,000 to 50,000 per square mile. The Bronx and Brooklyn, we're still in New York City, being the highest death rates. And then you get to the fourth borough, Queens, and 4 other counties, one of which is San Francisco, that still are well above the national average. And so what you have, and if you add to that the fact that we've heard Governor Cuomo and others from New York and other New York media especially suggest that, you know, well, New York had his problem at the beginning, and now the rest of the country is catching up with it. Well, that's just not happening. The chart here shows the green bar, which was the situation as of July 8. The blue bar was the situation through July 28. And I'll admit that New York has done a little better over the last 2 weeks than the rest of the country, but look that it has not changed the basic relationship at all. But anyway, that is a very quick overview.
But you know, it's very interesting to notice that anomaly here of Manhattan, right? Manhattan is the most densely populated place in the United States, and yet its mortality rate is only about 2/3 of what the other boroughs are. And you know, it was a nice clean little chart there where you had a buildup of more mortality as you got denser. Why do you think we have this anomaly in Manhattan?
Well, I think there are a number of reasons why it is. One is probably a minor issue, but it could be a point or two, is the fact that a huge number of people from Manhattan are spending their times in the Poconos and in Suffolk County and so on. A lot of people who had the ability to go to second homes and so on have done it. The New York Times had an article about 4 weeks or more ago that suggested that out of the city, you've lost something like 400,000 residents since the beginning of COVID, most of those being from Manhattan. I don't know what the exact figure is, and of course, it may not be right. But first of all, the Manhattan rate is probably understated due to the exodus of people. But there are some other things as well. If you live in Manhattan, Manhattan has by far the highest ratio of people who walk to work. 20% of the people in Manhattan walk to work. Well, walking is not bad at all with respect to COVID. Even if you're walking on Fifth Avenue, you're not coming in close contact for very long with people on the street. Whereas if you're coming in from the Bronx and Brooklyn, and by the way, a lot of people don't realize either that Manhattan only has about 800,000 workers, that is resident workers, and it has about 2.5 million jobs. So a lot of those people in the Bronx and Brooklyn, and Queens for that matter, are coming into Manhattan. And how are they coming into Manhattan? They're coming in largely on the subway and to a secondary effect on the buses, and even to some extent on the Metro North and the Long Island Railroad as well. Well, one of the big problems with this disease it is a disease that is spread by proximity. And so when we think about density here, it's not that the urban density all by itself is what's the problem. It is that urban density is associated with overcrowding in enclosed spaces. And there's plenty of evidence now that it's not just that social distancing is not enough. You've got to have real good ventilation, things like subway cars, buses, the low ceilings at Penn Station, for example, as opposed to the high ceilings at Grand Central Station, and crowded stores and all of those kinds of things really increase the what we call the exposure density in places like the Bronx, Brooklyn, and Queens, and other high density areas.
But isn't that also an issue of class? Like, when we were just talking to our friends in Houston, where there has been an outbreak, it seems to be not necessarily that the places are so dense, but that the housing is so dense. Is there a strong correlation with overcrowded households, which would, Manhattan, most people in Manhattan are single or double income, no kids. Bronx and Brooklyn probably have a lot. So is there a relationship that goes to class and how many people live in a unit more than how many people actually live per square mile?
Well, yeah, I mean, that's the whole point of exposure density. How many people live in your square mile is irrelevant if you get on a crowded train that isn't well ventilated, or if you live in very crowded housing. And crowded housing is an issue. I've not looked in great detail at crowded housing, but we've seen a lot of information coming out of California now about overcrowded housing. I think there's no question that overcrowded housing is a problem. In the case of New York City, though, it's not really overcrowded housing as much as it is comparing a place like Manhattan that has, like you say, the huge number of single-person households. So it's the Bronx and Brooklyn and Queens, their household size is not that much greater than the rest of the country. However, Manhattan's is much less because there are so many single people. So again, it's the same dynamic. It's not the overcrowding, however, in the Bronx and Brooklyn is not nearly as bad as it is in other parts of the country, especially parts of California.
Just out of curiosity, this chart, just to make it clear, is based on the residency of the person when they die, right? So where are they?
It is based. No, it is based upon where they die.
So a person may be a resident of Manhattan County or New York County, but
Right.
they might have died in Sullivan County at their summer home, or Suffolk County. They would be counted as Suffolk County death or as a Sullivan County.
Yeah, unfortunately, and that's why I say the Manhattan death rate may be somewhat understated. Much better would be the residential thing, but whatever.
Yeah.
It's still showing similar relationship.
Well, and for the people that are not entirely familiar with your data, where does Southern California, LA, and Orange County fall on this chart?
Okay, believe it or not, Orange County is one of the most densely populated counties in the country at about 5,000 per square mile in urban density. So it is in that 5,000 to 7,500 area. The death rates in California have been very low, well below the national average. And this has happened to a lot of parts of the country. LA County is also, as I recall, I should have checked it, LA County is around 7,500 per square mile. I think that they are in the 5,000 to 7,500 area. And of course, San Francisco County is going to be in the 10 to 24. Places like Alameda and Contra Costa is going to be a little bit lower.
Right, and just to give you a sense, I just actually looked at the numbers before we started. LA County's equivalent number on this chart for deaths is about, I believe, 0.18 as of today. For Orange County, it was about 0.15. So your point about it being much lower than the rest of the country it definitely holds up in the numbers.
Yeah, for example, when we did the report, and we're going to do an update, but when we did the comprehensive report 3 weeks ago, the nationwide death rate was 0.4, essentially. So that shows you how well California has done. There could be a lot of reasons for that. And that's why in looking at this, we have to recognize there's no one easy reason. And this has to do with things like lockdowns. When did this happen? When did that happen? All we know is if you are exposed in proximities that are not healthy, you're more likely to get the disease. So the fact that it sometimes doesn't look like density, the issue is personal contact.
Well, first of all, thank you for sharing that data. That's really a great piece of research. Let's move into the implications of that, which is, so, okay, if you're living in a dense place, guess what? You have a much greater likelihood of dying. What do you think will be the policy initiatives or changes that will come out of this and to try to protect people in the future?
Well, first of all, we see the policy changes occurring with respect to the lockdowns and so on. Right now, for example, in the world's largest business district, which is New York, south of 59th Street, you've got, as I understand it at the moment, buildings are only allowed to operate at 50% of capacity. Elevators, you've got to have the 6-foot social distancing. There are all sorts of limits on transit. And we're going to see that in other places too. I mean, you can look at downtown LA, for example, and while it's not by any means the largest central business district in the country, it has a high density for where it is. And you've got the same kinds of problems there. I don't think the policies are going to be that big a deal, though. I mean, seriously, I think it's going to be people. You got all sorts of indications that people are taking actions and looking at actions to reduce or minimize their exposure. And the big problem is we don't know when this is going to end. I mean, we're hearing about this might go well into 2021. So what are you going to do if right now, for example, in the city of New York, the subway is down 77%, even after the partial reopening that has occurred. The Long Island Railroad is down 83%, as is also the Metro. So I think what's going to be important here is people are going to make their own decisions, and policy can't keep up with it. At the same time, obviously, policy's got to do things like make sure there's sufficient social distancing and take actions for long lockdowns and that kind of thing where there is a problem. But in my own view, the very fact that we have destroyed this economy worse than any similar period of the Great Depression is unforgivable. Even though I don't think our policymakers knew what they were doing, nobody did, everybody in the world did it. But the basic point is we must no longer lock down. We must identify where there are problems and take specific actions there. And that's going to be the real challenge.
Why do you think there's been a reluctance to do that? I mean, it would seem to me the people who always talk about science, why don't we know what is actually causing it as opposed to supposing, because it almost seems to me like, and I'm a good little Californian. I wear a mask. I socially distance and all that. But is there, should there be some effort to sort of pinpoint, this is where the risk is, this is where it is? Like, I always thought it was ridiculous, like, if a friend of mine wants to bike on by the beach in LA, how is that dangerous relative to something else? I mean, has anyone really zeroed in, or is everything being so politicized that we can't come to reasonable policy prescriptions?
I think there is a very serious threat of that. There is a very concerted effort at the moment by the politically correct academic community in urban planning, and I'm not calling out all urban planners, and I'm not calling out all academicians. There is a very serious attempt to try to basically say density is not a problem. Now, you tell me how a disease that passes person to person can't be a problem when things are overcrowded. We're talking about sunrises in the West studies. I mean, it's a real problem. And so there is that problem. I mean, yes, indeed, I think we do need to sit down, forget political correctness, forget ideology, and figure out what happened. And the other thing is that, anyway, I think that's really the key thing.
Well, and so the question that I have is kind of the broader notion of changes in building codes.
Yeah.
Right. If you think about it at the core, right, what do we fiddle with and what don't we fiddle with? I just read an article yesterday in Wired magazine looking at all of the innovations that people are thinking about putting into the structure of multi-tenant buildings. I mean, things like as simple as if you're building a skyscraper, windows that open, or ventilation systems that are individual to the unit and aren't necessarily shared on a centralized basis. Well, all of which, of course, have some cost impact, have probably a cascading effect of other technologies that need to be put in place in order for those to be put in place. What do you think is going to be happening? Do you think that we'll have these kinds of reviews, or do you think people will just kind of just slough it off?
Well, a couple of things. I mean, we'll have those kind of reviews. I'm not terribly excited about those kind of reviews. I mean, people are going to change this. You're going to, people are not going to any longer stand and wait for an elevator that's crowded. I think the market, and I'm not suggesting we not look at this and there's no point in public policy, but I do think the public has been scared enough by this thing. We can see that by the fact that New Yorkers are not returning to work at this point.
Well, and by the drop in spending, by the 9% drop in the economy last quarter.
Yeah, I mean, we know that. I think anybody that has an opportunity, I put it this way, I doubt you're going to see a lot of 50-story office buildings built in the near future, and I'll bet that some that are under construction, and there are a lot, as you know, in a lot of cities around the country, some are probably never going to be filled. And anymore, there may not even be the interest in converting them to apartments, since again, that's an overcrowded situation. So I think that people's preferences and corporate preferences and investor preferences are going to be the driving force here, even though, of course, there is a role for government.
Yeah. Well, let's switch into something that's near and dear to your heart, that you are one of the world's experts on, which is transit. What do you think is going to happen with transit, and what should happen with transit?
Well, it's a particularly bad time for transit with respect to this, because who knows when the driverless car really comes. Maybe it's 10, 20, 30 years. So right away, the driverless car was one big threat to transit, because if the hype about driverless cars is true, we will be able to move low-income people that don't have cars by driverless cars to exactly where they need to go instead of within a mile of where they need to go. But the other point is that I think what's happening to transit we see right now. People are going to be seeking to go to use cars, to drive. Some will bike, et cetera, et cetera. But I think transit is in serious trouble. And what concerns me is it looks very much that they will need just as money not to do what they should be doing as they used to need to do what they were doing.
So let's say, Wendell, I just appointed you head of planning for New York City.
Right.
I'm always asked this question, how does New York City come back? There seems to be a lot of them that say, oh, everything's great, we're going to continue the way we are. And, I mean, that seems to be sort of nonsensical, but what can, if I'm sitting in Manhattan or let's say the denser parts of Brooklyn, what policy steps can I take? How do I approach I mean, New York is, not going to go out of existence. And it has some great assets. So what policy would you take if you were in charge of planning in New York now?
Oh, first of all, I wouldn't take the job, but I'll answer the question.
But by the way, I'd ask for a raise for the first.
Yeah, real big raise. The point is that, and let me talk about Manhattan, because that has both the employment density, it's got the highest employment density probably in the world for a business district, and pretty high residential density. And there, I think, to follow up on sort of Marshall's question, there is a place where government could take an important role in leading. New York City government probably should be commissioning some good, strong research to figure out what it would take to make New York City safe. And no more of this baloney of trying to pretend away the problems of overcrowding and density. Now, my concern is, I really find it hard to believe that Manhattan can support 2.5 million jobs anymore. Maybe 500,000. I mean, I think we're talking, and so the problem is now, it's not going to go to that overnight, and we'll probably go back to the status quo, and everybody will pretend it didn't happen. But if you want to make New York safe, you have got to have something that looks more like suburban densities. I'm not nearly as concerned about housing densities in New York City, that is in Manhattan, at least, among the upper middle class and above, because they're housed relatively well, and most of the poor people south of 125th have been driven out of the city. So you'd have to deal with that. But these employment densities are unbelievable. I mean, there are employment densities of a million per square mile. Almost the square mile that the new Commodore, the new Vanderbilt building is being built on across the street from Grand Central. That is right at 1 million per square mile in terms of employment density.
But
Wow.
the question that I have is, isn't that kind of a illusory number in the world of remote work? So you may have 1 million people theoretically employed in a square mile, but in fact, maybe only, a tenth of them, I'm making that number up, I have no idea, a tenth of them are actually showing up because they're working from home most of the time.
Well, and by the way, that again is the kind of thing where the city would want to take the leadership. If they could basically convince companies to operate in such a manner that they don't have to reduce staff headquartered in New York, but only 1/10 of them or whatever the number, that's exactly the kind of thinking that I would hope I would have thought of but would have failed to.
But, and I would think in that situation too, if you had a situation where you're working at home most of the time and maybe you come in for a meeting or to meet with your clients, but if you go on the Metro North at 11 in the morning, you could probably social distance on the Metro North.
Well, not only that, you might even be able to drive.
Right.
Which is the best way you could do it. This is the great advantage here. If we can figure out a way to do the social distancing, whether it's 6 feet at the office or working different hours, it would be a wonderful thing to eliminate traffic congestion in the city of New York.
Yeah, well, and imagine if it's an electrically driven autonomous vehicle.
What's that?
If it's an electrically powered autonomous vehicle, then you not only have the less density of traffic, but you have lower air pollution in the city.
Oh yeah, no, it makes all the sense in the world. Because I do not believe, I mean, what is the point of putting together of a Metro North train or a subway car that carries from 80 to 200 people, depending on how many standees we've got, and having to do social distancing? It strikes me that just doesn't make any sense. It would be like attempting to build an airplane that carries as many people as the HMS Queen Elizabeth. There just wasn't any need for it.
Let me ask you this. A lot of the people criticizing what we've been writing point to Asian cities that are very dense. Now, I know they've had some outbreaks recently. What about the argument that, well, Seoul and Hong Kong and Taipei and Singapore have done relatively well? Is there something we can learn from them, or is it just not applicable?
Well, first of all, we ought to look, because why did they do this? And if you look at the Korean example, there seemed to be plenty of evidence that they were ready for it. They knew what they were going to do. Taiwan, similarly. So yes, there's plenty to learn. However, we've got to be very careful with these death rate numbers we see. For example, take Wuhan. I hate to pick on Wuhan, but I've read somewhere that the COVID death rate in Wuhan is much below what we have here. What are we looking at? You know, Chinese cities, for example, have huge rural areas, and they cover, there are Chinese cities that are almost as big as San Bernardino County. When you talk about a death rate in Chinese cities or Vietnamese cities or Japanese cities, you have to know what geography you're talking about. We don't even know that. And for example, we know Tokyo has done apparently fairly well. What we need to do is go in and say, well, now just what do we mean by Tokyo? And how does that compare to the rural, smaller areas or places like Okayama or Sapporo or any number of smaller places? I mean, it may be that the same relationship occurs there, but the curve doesn't look as bad, because clearly we did something real wrong here. I mean, there was something dreadfully wrong in New York. I don't know what it was, but there was something dreadfully wrong.
Well, and I would say Milan and
oh yeah, right,
Barcelona, and and now my understanding is now that Spain opened up, they've had a huge outbreak again.
Yeah, and one of the problems is, with all due respect, and it's my field, nobody understands urban geography. You put a number in front of a reporter and they say that the death rate in Dalian was such and such, and they go ahead and say, well, this is a city of 7 million people. Let's compare that to New York. No, no, no. Do you have any idea what the geography is like? I mean, cities are not cities, and that we could talk about for an hour.
But since we don't have an hour,
right.
but what I'd like to just switch over, just because I think it's parallel, is what do you think is going to be the impact of the disorders, and whether there's a relationship with the pandemic, and will that also encourage people to look for other places?
Well, from what I read in the press and from what I remember from the 70s, my sense is it could be very significant. There's all sorts of indication that people are concerned. The first duty of government is security. And people, I don't know what's going to happen, and I certainly hope we can have a peace and not have things continue in the way they're going. But I think it is clearly, nobody is going to be looking to locate a business in some of the cities we're seeing with trouble right now. I'm talking about the urban cores, especially where the troubles are.
I mean, you're talking about Minneapolis, Seattle.
Well, right now, Minneapolis, Seattle, and Portland. I mean, one great thing about this country is there's plenty of room. And if we run out of room here, we've already shown we have a great ability to move everything to some other country, so it's not a big deal.
Plus, but the cities that you mentioned, Minneapolis, Portland, there's so much power in the suburbs there. There's so much of a reason, if you're going to start a business, to say, hey, let's just put it out in, Edina or wherever it happens to be, that, you won't even check the box of consideration for the inner city. And while in the old days, we had something that would be known as civic pride,
right?
Where people would go, oh my God, I can't conceive of giving up on the city. Today, I'm not so sure that mindset still exists.
I think you're right. I mean, right now, for example, what most of our downtown areas have not grown in terms of their employment in the last 10 or 20 years. New York New York has done very well. I mean,
Chicago.
Employment-wise, it's about the same. The city has grown a little bit.
San Francisco.
They're not that much growth. No, New York has been it, but the champion has been Seattle. Amazon's huge campus, huge increase. They went from a downtown area with about 150,000 employees to over 200,000 in 6 years.
Wow.
Well, let me tell you, I really do not expect downtown Seattle to grow anymore. I've talked to friends that but work in downtown Seattle. Apparently it is a ghost town at this point.
And it appears that Amazon feels the same way you do.
What's that?
It seems like Amazon feels the same way you do. They're moving their sites to other places in the country.
And
Well,
also to
beyond that-
Bellevue and Redmond.
Right. Yeah. Beyond that, Bezos, a year ago, I think it was, basically suggested when the city of Seattle tried. I mean, there are other problems too. I mean, trying to impose confiscatory taxes on them and so on. After the last attempt, Amazon basically says there will be no more growth downtown Seattle, and that was a year ago before any of these problems.
Yeah. I was just in Nashville last week, and quite the opposite feel of what the typical downtown historically dense area is. A lot of construction, a lot of actually residential construction, as well as what I would call kind of infill construction in not really in the suburbs, still close into the city, but taking areas that might have been more industrial or transit, transportation like rail areas, and converting them into more hip professional services kinds of space, and seemed very, very alive for even during the COVID.
Well, Nashville has done very well. It's one of the real stars at this point. And there are a number of other cities that are doing that too. But Nashville's great advantage. I mean, you go back to 1950, Nashville was only about 170,000 people. It was not that big. I mean, Nashville may look old to you. It's got a beautiful capital. It goes back to like 1830 or something like that. But Nashville, is now over 2 million people, spreads out all over the place, and is a highly suburban, dispersed area. And so it's not surprising it's doing well. And there are a lot of other ones, especially in the South. And believe it or not, places like Columbus and Kansas City at this point in the Midwest are doing well.
Sure, and Des Moines, right. Places
Des Moines,
that people would have written off in the era when we were talking about the Rust Belt.
Right.
This is kind of the reemergence of areas of the Rust Belt that people had overlooked and now coming back.
Well, AEI, the American Enterprise Institute, is producing a weekly bulletin, and I don't know whose work they're using, but they are looking at walking, foot traffic, and I'm not sure how they get it. And they do a chart every week on the foot traffic in the major metropolitan areas around the country. Number one is Kansas City in terms of recovery, and number two, believe it or not, is St. Louis, where I am. And believe me, St. Louis is not setting the world on fire.
But I think that, so just to sort of wrap this up, where do you see cities going post-pandemic, post-social disorders? Where are we going? What would you advise cities to do?
Well, I think first of all, the question is, where are people going? One of the basic problems with urban planning has been about structure. It has been about places. It has been about cities, and it has ignored the needs of people. And that's a real problem. So urban planning can continue to be irrelevant and have a few victories here and there, or it can begin to try to figure out what people prefer and serve their needs. And so I think, I think the best thing cities can do is begin to listen to people. And I don't mean just the people that are able to come to their hearings at 3:00 in the afternoon.
Well, hopefully, Wendell, that people will listen to you on this podcast because you make tremendous sense. I want to thank you for joining us and look forward to having you on our program again. And thank you, everybody. And Joel, any last comments?
No, I just think that look, Wendell, you can't say he's always right, but he's right a lot of the time. And what we want to do with the podcast is get people thinking about different ways, because most of the kids who study urban development are being told you have to have transit, it has to be dense, that's the only way to go. And we know after the pandemics and after the disorders, things are probably going the other direction. So I think it's time to look at it. But a very last point, and this is really a great thing in Wendell's work, when people say, well, since COVID isn't this, and this happening, Wendell can show that the moving out of the big cities was happening well before COVID. So it is simply accelerating the pattern.
Exactly.
Well, thank you, and we look
Thank you.
forward to our next podcast and look forward to your feedback.
Thank you very much.
Take
Thank
care.
you, Wendell.